Hi, this is Joy at Red Pine Quilt Shop. Today we're going to talk about how to put a project together using Tensister's Easy Piecing Grid. When you're working with the grid, you will typically have a pattern such as the one in front of me. Maybe you've taken a photograph and you've run it through a software program to pixelate it and you're recreating that photograph, or some of the wonderful patterns that come from Tensister's handicraft. The projects are made with a combination of half square triangles and squares, and you will lay them out on your grid. So the grid starts out looking like this. You want to make sure that you have the fusible side of the grid up. So if you can read your column and row numbers, you have the fusible side up, and you can also feel it's a little bit rough. So you will start out by laying out your squares on the grid like the project that you see in front of me. So I've laid out my squares, I've laid out my half square triangles. Now, as you're laying them out on the grid, you can do a couple different things. If you have a small iron, you can simply just touch the small clover iron that has a little heart-shaped blade. Works good to just touch and spot set the squares. I work on top of my ironing board and I lay out a section, and I normally use my big iron and I'm just careful to press. You don't want to start going sideways. You want to just pick up and set down and pick up and set down, and you can set sections that way as well. Now for half square triangles, I like to glue baste those with my Sewline glue pen because I want to make sure that I'm getting that seam line lined up so it is hitting those crosshair points perfectly between a section. So I do glue baste them because I don't want to bump that even at all when I touch it with my iron. The squares you don't have to worry about. Now you'll notice that there are some small gaps between the squares. That is part of how the grid is designed. It is actually designed to build in that little bit that you're going to lose in the seam allowance. I can press on top of this with my iron, and because I'm pressing on top of the fabric, it's keeping my iron out of that fusible surface, so I don't normally have issues with it sticking, but you can certainly put a pressing cloth down as well. So after you have your grid sections spot set, you're going to want to press it really good. Now before you do that press, you will want to come in and trim these margin areas off your panel, and you can see on this one, this top area, I am trimmed right at my line. So before I did that trim though, I had all of this section up there. I had the numbers, I had the logo. So I trimmed that off before I did a really good press and made sure everything was fused down super well, because then it would be too easy for me to touch that with my iron. So after you have everything laid out, you have it spot set, then come back, trim your panel around any sides that you don't need to connect to another panel, and at that point you're ready to do a super good press. You can use steam to do that, and that will help to fuse it really good to the panel. Now, areas that you need to connect a panel, there you want to leave a bit of a margin, and as you're doing that good press, you want to make your panel connections. So you can see if I flip this over to the back, I have connected two panels here. The nice thing about the patterns that come from Tensister's, she marks the panels for you. So those red lines tell me that's a panel, and here I'm using leftover. So she marks them for you, which is nice. So to connect panels, what I like to do there is to leave 3/8 to a 1/2 inch. You can get by with 1/4, that'll be all right. I usually try to do about 3/8, and when I am ready to do those connections, I will take my panel and I will trim it to 3/8 to a 1/2 inch. So I've trimmed this panel down. There was more panel margin there, but I've trimmed it down. But I've left that along the whole bottom edge of my panel because I have another row that needs to go on there. Now to do that row, I'm using scrap, a scrap column from the side of this panel because I didn't need it all. See how I've got a little extra there? You can tell I'm not using all 9 columns. So I've taken the scrap from this and I'm using that to finish that bottom row. So I left a little margin there, and I took and I created my row. And now what I'm going to do is to make sure that I am matching up those little crosshair points is what I want to pay attention to as I'm getting ready to fuse this together. So I will line up those little crosshair points, and then I will simply fuse these panels to each other. And when I'm done, I will have the whole section, the whole little table runner, all in one piece, all ready to sew, and I will sew them in big long seams. To do a scrappy project like this without Tensister's Easy Piecing Grid, you would be sewing a lot of short 1.5 inch seams, which are very time consuming to sew. You're going to be doing lots of sewing, lots of chain piece cutting apart, and with the grid I will have the entire thing put together. And when I start to sew this, we'll cover sewing and pressing in another video, but when I start to sew this, the nice thing is I will be sewing big long seams, which are so much faster and more efficient a way to sew than all those little short seams. And yet I'll end up with a wonderful, fun, scrappy project when I'm finished.